My friend and my brother, John Lewis, thank you for inviting me to be here. Thank you for coming to Washington and saying come to the state of Washington, come to Kings County, come to Seattle. And for John Lewis, to ask John Lewis to come, I couldn't say no. Mr. County Executive and all of the honorable elected officials, labor leaders, religious leaders, my beloved sisters and brothers, I am very pleased, happy, and delighted to be here in this great city, in this great state, but to be here in King County, the only county in America, the only county named for Martin Luther King, Jr. I come here to say thank you. Thank you. When I saw the letterhead, saw the likeness of Dr. King, I was moved to tears. Because you perhaps more than any other county in America, more than any other county, has gone so far to put this man, this leader, this prophet on your letterhead. So I say thank you again. It is good to see so many of you here, and I shouldn't start calling names, but Reverend Dr. Samuel McKinney, who worked so closely with Dr. King and a close friend, it is good to see you. I tell you, if it was not for Martin Luther King, Jr., for him teaching and preaching the philosophy of nonviolence, I would not be standing here today as a member of the United States House of Representatives. Now, I didn't grow up in a big city like Seattle. I didn't grow up in a big city like Portland or Chicago or Detroit or New York or Washington, D.C. or Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up in rural Alabama, about 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. My family still owns that land today. On this farm, we raised a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. I know here in King County, here in Seattle, here in the state of Washington, you don't know anything about raising peanuts. You don't know anything about raising chickens. John Lewis will tell you, if you come to my Washington office, or maybe visit me in my office in downtown Atlanta, the moment you walk through the door, the first thing the staff will offer you will be some peanuts, because we raise a lot of peanuts in Georgia. And the Georgia Peanut Commission provides us with peanuts to make available to our visitors. I don't eat too many of those peanuts. I ate so many peanuts when I was growing up in rural Alabama, I just don't want to see no more peanuts. Sometime I get on a flight flying from Atlanta to Washington, or Washington back to Atlanta, or flying out here last night. The flight attendant tried to push some peanuts on me, and I said, no, thank you. I won't bore you, but when I was growing up, it was my responsibility to raise the chickens and to care for the chickens, and I fell in love with raising chickens like no one else could raise chicken. I became very good at it. Now, some of you may know something about raising chickens. But I had to take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Now, some of you smart teachers and students, lawyers and doctors and judges, wonderful law enforcement individuals, and I want to take the time to thank all of the law enforcement individuals for all of your service and your contribution. I know here in this city and in this state, you have suffered great loss. Thank you for putting your lives on the line every single day. But you don't know anything about raising chickens. You really don't. I used to take those fresh eggs and mark them with a pencil and place them under the setting hen and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Some of you may be saying, now, John Lewis, why do you mark those fresh eggs with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more eggs, and they had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. And when these little chicks were hatched, I would fool these setting hens. I would cheat on these setting hens. I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen. I'll put them in a box with a lantern, raise them on their own, get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, encourage the setting hen to stay on the nest for another 3 weeks. When I look back on it, it was not the right thing to do, to cheat on these setting hens. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most nonviolent thing to do. It was not the most democratic thing to do. But I just kept on cheating on these setting hens. We used to get the Sizzle Roebuck catalog. And are you old enough to remember the Sizzle Roebuck catalog? Some people called it the Ordering Book. Other people called it the Bush Book. I wish I had this. I wish I had that. So I couldn't save enough money to get an incubator or a hatcher, so I just kept on cheating on these setting hens. But as a young guy, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, with the help of my brothers and sisters and my first cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard like you would gather here in this beautiful theater. My brothers and sisters and first cousins would line the outside of the chicken yard, and they would become part of the congregation, and I would start speaking or preaching. And when I think about it and look back to the 40s and the 50s, some of these chickens would bow their heads, some of these chickens would shake their head. These chickens never quite said amen. But I am convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to in the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. As a matter of fact, some of those chickens were just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. Now, the congressperson who represents the heart of Seattle is my seatmate on the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Jim McDermott. I love him like a brother. He's a wonderful man. Now, Jim, we traveled to India together. We retraced the steps that Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife took 50 years ago. Jim been with me to Birmingham, to Montgomery, and he walked across that bridge with us in Selma. And we're going back there for the 45th anniversary, the first weekend in March. When I was growing up in rural Alabama, I saw those signs that said white men, white women, colored women, white waiting. I saw those signs. And I would come home and ask my parents, my grandparents and great-grandparents, why segregation? Why racial discrimination? And they would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. On a Saturday morning, I remember going downtown, brothers and sisters and first cousins, to the theater. And all of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony. And all of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. And I would come home and say, why? And my father, mother, my grandparents and great-grandparents would say, don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But one day in 1955, 15 years old, in the 10th grade, I heard the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. on the old radio. He was talking about the discipline and philosophy of nonviolence. He was talking about the Montgomery bus boycott. The words, the action, the leadership of Dr. King responding to Rosa Parks' arrest inspired me to find a way to get in the way. And I got in the way. I got in trouble. And for almost 50 years, I've been getting in the way and getting in trouble, good trouble, because of Martin Luther King Jr. During those days, all across the South, many people live in fear. People are afraid to be afraid. Martin Luther King Jr. had the ability and the capacity to liberate us from our fear. He brought down those signs. He gave us the courage to walk out of darkness into the light of day. After I finished high school in May of 1957, at the age of 17, I wrote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a letter. I told him I wanted to attend a little college called Troy State College, now known as Troy University, only 10 miles from my home. I submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the college. I said to Dr. King, I need your help. I need your support. He sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. In the meantime, I had been accepted at a little college in Nashville, Tennessee. An uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had, gave me a Foot Locker trunk. I put my clothing, my books, everything in that trunk, except those chickens, and went off to Nashville. And after being there for about 2 weeks, I told one of my teachers, a young man named Kelly Miller Smith, that I'd been in contact with Dr. King. He was a friend of Dr. King. He informed Martin Luther King Jr. that I was in school in Nashville. Dr. King wrote me and suggested when I was home from spring break to come and see him. In March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, on a Saturday morning, my father drove me to the Greyhound bus station. I boarded a bus and traveled the 50 miles from Troy to Montgomery. And a young African-American lawyer who had been a lawyer for Rosa Parks, for Dr. King, and the Montgomery movement, met me at the Greyhound bus station and drove me to the First Baptist Church, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the office of the church. I saw Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy standing behind a desk. I was so scared, I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Dr. King, I'm John Robert Lewis." That was the beginning of my involvement with Martin Luther King Jr. and my involvement in the Civil Rights Movement. As I came to know Dr. King and the life of the movement, my admiration for the man also grew. He was a man who spoke to the heart and conscience of all of us who believed that nonviolence was a more excellent way. His message was love. His weapon was truth. His method was creative nonviolence. His goal was the beloved community. A society based on simple justice that valued the dignity and the worth of every human being. Just think, before Martin Luther King Jr., in a city like Atlanta, Birmingham, New Orleans, Richmond, Raleigh, Durham, all across the South, it was impossible for blacks and whites to sit together at a lunch counter or together in a restaurant. All across the South, on trains and buses, people were segregated. In the state of Alabama, black people and white people couldn't share a taxi cab together, couldn't stay in the same hotel. But Dr. King inspired a generation of us to rise up and change that. when leaders in our nation said no, Dr. King convinced them to say yes. Just think, a few short years ago, people were beaten, tear gas, bullwhips, locked in jail for attempting to register to vote. The state of Mississippi in 1963, 64, 65 had a black voting age population of more than 450,000 and only about 16,000 blacks registered to vote. Many young people came from this state. Ministers came from Seattle. People came from all across our country. The summer of 1964, 3 young men that I knew, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Schraney, went out to investigate the burning of an African-American church. These 3 young men, arrested, taken to jail on a Sunday night, later turned over to the Klan where they were beaten, shot, and killed. These 3 young men didn't die in Vietnam. They didn't die in the Middle East. They didn't die in Eastern Europe. They didn't die in Africa or Central or South America. They died right here in our own country trying to get all of our citizens to become participants in the democratic process. One county in the state of Alabama, Lowndes County between Selma and Montgomery, the county was more than 80% African American, but not a single registered African American voter. In a little town like Selma, Alabama, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. The only time you could even attempt to go downtown and go into the courthouse and get a copy of the so-called literacy test were the first and third Mondays of each month. Black doctors, black ministers, lawyers, high school principals, college professors flunking the so-called literacy test. On one occasion, a man was asked to count the number of bubbles on a bar of soap. On another occasion, a man was asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. 45 years ago, that effort came to a head when we attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery, to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people of color wanted to register to vote. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired us. Never, ever give up. Never, ever give in. Never, ever give out. To keep the faith and to keep our eyes on the prize. And I got arrested a few times. I went to jail 40 times during the 60s. Beaten, left bloody and unconscious at the Greyhound bus station in Rock Hill, South Carolina in 1961. But the same man that beat me in 1961, in February last year, he came to my office in Washington with his son to apologize and say, "I'm sorry. Will you accept my apology? Will you forgive me?" And I said, yes. He hugged me, he cried, and I shed some tears. It's the power of nonviolence. It's the power of reconciliation. It's the power of believing that somehow, in some way, we can overcome and create that sense of community, the beloved community that Dr. King taught us. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. taught us not to hate. He would say over and over again, hate is too heavy a burden to bear. Some of the same people and their family members of some of the same people that attacked us in Selma are saying to me today, have said to me during the past few years, John Lewis, on behalf of all of the people of Alabama, forgive us of what we did. There's nothing wrong with saying to someone, forgive me, and saying, I accept your apology. Let's be reconciled. Let's create that sense of community. For in a real sense, we all live in the same house. When I was growing up outside of True, Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, I had an aunt by the name of Seneva. And my Aunt Seneva lived in what we call a shotgun house. I know here in Kings County, here in Seattle, here in Washington, you have never seen a shotgun house. You don't even know what I'm talking about. But my Aunt Seneva lived in a shotgun house. She didn't have a green manicured lawn. Had a simple, plain dirt yard. And sometime at night, you can look up through the ceiling, through the tin roof, the holes, and count the stars. And when it would rain, she would get a pail, a bucket, or a tub and catch the rainwater. I know what I'm talking about because I was born in a shotgun house. From time to time, my Aunt Seneva would walk out into the woods and take branches from a dogwood tree and tie these branches together and make a broom, and she called that broom the breast broom. And she would sweep this dirt yard very clean, sometimes 2 and 3 times a week, but especially on a Friday or Saturday because she wanted that dirt yard to look good during the weekend. For those of you who may not know what a shotgun house is, in the nonviolent sense, it's the old house, one way in, one way out, maybe a tin roof, where you can bounce a basketball through the front door and it will go straight out the back door. My Aunt Seneva lived in a shotgun house. But one Saturday afternoon, a group of my brothers and sisters and a few of my first cousins, about 12 or 15 of us young children, were playing in her yard. An unbelievable storm came up. The wind started blowing, the thunder started rolling, the lightning started flashing, and the rain started beating on the tin roof of this old shotgun house. One became terrified. She started crying. She got all of us little children together and told us to hold hands, and we did as we were told. The wind continued to blow. The thunder continued to roll. The lightning continued to flash, and the rain continued to beat on this tin roof of this old shotgun house. And when one corner of this old house appeared to be lifting from its foundation, Mom had us to walk to that corner to try to hold our house down with our little bodies. When the other corner appeared to be lifted, she had us to walk to that side. We were little children walking with the wind, but we never left the house. Call it the house of King County. Call it the house of Seattle. Call it the house of Washington. Call it the house of Georgia or California. Call it American house. Call it the house of Europe or Africa or Asia. Call it the house of Haiti. We all live in the same house. Dr. King was saying, and he's still speaking to us today, saying we are one people, we are one family, we are one house. Maybe, just maybe, we all came to this great country in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. So we must stay together. We must walk together and never, never leave that house of the beloved community. So I said to you, hang in there. Keep the faith. If someone had told me when I was marching, sitting in with Dr. King, getting arrested and going to jail, that one day I'll sit on the steps of the Capitol when a young man by the name of Barack Obama would walk on out of the Capitol to the steps, and the first person to get to would be John Lewis and give me a hug and say, John, I need your help. I need your prayers. I would say, you crazy. You out of your mind. You don't know what you're talking about. If it hadn't been for Martin Luther King Jr. teaching nonviolence, the way of love, the way of peace, hadn't been for Gandhi, hadn't been for the teaching of the great teacher, we wouldn't be where we are today. So when people said nothing have changed, I said, come and walk in my shoes. Walk in the shoes of Martin Luther King Jr., and you'll see the changes that have occurred. Look around. So King County, thank you. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for all that you will continue to do. Thank you for honoring Martin Luther King Jr., this great prophet of the 20th century. Thank you very much.